Yeah, as Martin said, I work at UNEP WCMC. It's essentially a specialist biodiversity center of UNEP based in Cambridge. Essentially, we provide biodiversity knowledge, data, and information that's needed to support good decisions and policies. It's a collaboration between UNEP and a UK-based charity called WCMC. And we have about over 100 staff, including biodiversity scientists, social scientists, economists, and fundraisers. That's just a quick overview of where I work. But today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about a paper that we published in 2020, last year, on perspectives on area-based conservation and its meaning for the future of biodiversity policy. And I'm going to walk you through why we undertook this review, how we identified what we call perspectives and what they represent, and how they could be implemented in practice to achieve a long-term vision for biodiversity. It's clear now from evidence that as the pace of biodiversity loss continues to accelerate, the links between this loss and global challenges are becoming better understood. And from this graph and many other studies, you can see that the proportion of species becoming extinct is increasing exponentially over time. Well, as we enter the new decade, 2020 and beyond, it's clear that biodiversity loss needs to be addressed not only for the sake of species and ecosystems, but also to ensure the survival of human societies and well-being. Again, this is a graph, but there's many studies that have shown that we're losing benefits to nature. We're losing benefits from nature to people. And this includes provision of clean water, climate regulation, and many other environmental benefits that go alongside with nature. So what measures are in place? We can think of protected areas, which are a globally recognized approach to the conservation of nature. They're defined as a clear geographical space that's recognized, dedicated, and managed through legal or effective means to achieve the long-term conservation of nature, with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So there is a clear definition for what a protected area is, and their core goal is to provide safe havens for species. But these also offer vital solutions to some of the most pressing global challenges, including climate change, water scarcity, food insecurity, and poverty. Because protected areas have a critical role to play in tackling the global nature crisis, they've been enshrined in global biodiversity commitments. I just want to give you a quick overview of the current global biodiversity commitments before we move forward. So in 2010, governments of the world reiterated their commitment to ensure conservation of biodiversity, its wise use, and sharing of benefits from the use of genetic resources. It's called the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity. It contains 20 Aichi biodiversity targets, which provide a framework for action both at national and international levels to work towards a vision for biodiversity of living in harmony with nature by 2050. Related to this strategic plan are the goals and targets that have also been set out under the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, notably goals 14 and 15, which are highlighted here, to conserve life below water and life on land. And these complement the specific area-based target, Aichi Target 11 under the strategic plan, which essentially calls for at least 17% of terrestrial and inland water areas and 10% of coastal and marine areas to be conserved through effectively and equitably managed, ecologically representative and well-connected systems of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, commonly referred to as OECMs. This is quite a mouthful, but I'm going to walk you through it bit by bit as we continue the talk. So to date, what progress has been made towards the current Aichi Target 11 under the Strategic Plan for Biodiversity? UNEP WCMC manages the Protected Planet Initiative in collaboration with IUCN. Protected Planet Initiative is really used to track where protected areas are globally and looks at what proportion of the planet protected areas cover. And over the next few years, we will be increasingly using this data to track how well they're being managed and governed. Well, progress to date has been mixed. And despite concerted global efforts and significant progress, the absolute targets, as I mentioned earlier, to conserve 17% of land and inland waters and 10% of coastal and marine areas have not yet been met. The current statistics show that 15% of the world's terrestrial surface and inland waters and just over 7% of the global ocean lies within protected areas. And the majority of these areas are concentrated within the exclusive economic zone, so areas within national jurisdiction, within the marine realm, of course, where currently just under 18% is protected. So there's a lot of ocean space that still could benefit from further protection and conservation. But that's just the coverage aspects, and we also need to consider the other elements around Aichi Target 11 that were already mentioned above. So these statistics are updated monthly, and they're available on Protected Planet, so you can always go in and explore the data and download the data and use the data. Over the past 10 years, we've seen a rise of novel ideas about area-based conservation, and the debates have intensified around these visions for protected and conserved areas. Some of these discussions have focused around the need to continue implementing the current elements of Aichi Target 11 for a further 10 years to ensure that all its qualitative elements are met. Others suggest that we need to scale up the area of the world that must be protected and conserved to halt biodiversity. For example, half Earth, nature needs half, and the likes. There are many, many studies that have been done, and these are just a few examples. Other studies have suggested that we need to emphasize benefits of nature to humans and explore market-based approaches. While other studies have been driven more by a sense of a more systemic change in what is really required to effectively conserve and manage our planet. So as part of the study that we undertook last year in the paper that was published, we considered what perspectives are really. Perspectives are different outlooks. They just represent different outlooks on the relationship between human and non-human life. However, with all these papers and all these perspectives, it was a bit unclear how they would be implemented in practice and the implications of this for biodiversity and human well-being, and also how these would contribute towards the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. So what we did here was essentially we reviewed the literature, we summarized all these papers into 4 broad categories through the literature review, through expert consultations, informal discussions at various meetings between, I would say, 2016 and 2020. And then we distilled the debate and set out possible approaches for implementation and explored their potential unintended consequences. So I'd just like to walk you through how I'm going to present the next few slides. These are the sort of the broad categories: Aichi Plus, ambitious area-based conservation targets, new conservation, and whole Earth. And for each of these perspectives, I'm just going to give you a very brief rationale of each, a few possible approaches to consider for practical application and some of the unintended consequences for each of these perspectives. And the literature is vast, so I've just selected a few examples, but the paper has many more details and a lot more literature if you're interested for further reading. So IHE Plus, as I said, it's a way to continue implementing the targets under the strategic plan for biodiversity up until 2030. So recognizing that we have made progress in protected area coverage. This is evidenced in Protected Planet reports that UNEP WCMC publishes every 2 years, which tracks the progress around IHE Target 11. We also recognize there are shortfalls in effective implementation, and most of the emphasis has been on achieving quantitative coverage. So really looking at the quantity of areas that are being protected rather than the quality. And so here IHE Plus is looking at how we can achieve all elements of the target and fill any gaps and indicators that are required to monitor progress. So possible approaches around Target 11. We know that this target has incentivized national action. Its increased coverage is remarkable, but increasing coverage alone will not save biodiversity. And it's critical that we focus on protected area quality as well as quantity. But the focus on quality is really a function of where we place these protected areas, so the location, and the impact, the long-term impact that protected areas have on biodiversity conservation. So ensuring that protected areas are effectively managed through adequate resources in pursuit of protected area objectives will help achieve biodiversity outcomes. Ensuring that protected areas are placed in the right places and are prioritized to represent all elements of biodiversity will also help in achieving ecological outcomes. And increasing the recognition and support for protected areas that are governed by Indigenous peoples and local communities or private individuals, as well as recognizing other areas, so OECMs that I mentioned earlier, such as sacred sites, for example, could also contribute towards helping improve biodiversity conservation across the wider land and seascape and enhance connectivity and making sure that global conservation efforts are more ecologically represented and targeted. And in this way, in doing so, you really end up promoting equitable inclusion of a diverse range of stakeholders in conservation efforts. So this is kind of the framing of IHE Plus. However, with every perspective comes possible unintended consequences that we need to explore further. So even though IHE Target Plus may be pragmatic, there are some studies that have shown that even if the quantitative targets are to be met, the current percentage targets of 17 and 10% are inadequate to conserve biodiversity and ecosystem services. And some studies have also showed that the percentage targets have indeed resulted in perverse incentives for some countries, which only focus on quantity rather than quality. So we need to be careful how we view these targets as well. If I move on to the second perspective, which is really about ambitious, scaling up area-based conservation, we've seen that the current levels of protection do not come close to what is really needed to halt biodiversity loss. And based on this perspective, there's ample of evidence that the Earth's last intact landscapes and seascapes are critical to conserve the area and the integrity of all ecosystems across land and sea by 2050. And there are various calls to protect 2030. Protect 30% by 2030 and half Earth by 2050, and to address the species extinction crisis and conserve ecological heritage for future generations. There are other proposals that argue that there's an urgent need to also maintain critical ecosystem functions for the benefits of humans and make room for growth in protected areas. So this is kind of the broad, ambitious type of perspective, 30 by 30, 50 by 2050. What are the possible approaches that could be considered again for prioritizing these areas? Where on Earth would you think of conserving 50%? So there are numerous approaches that focus on protecting, conserving, restoring, retaining natural areas of land and sea. And these are underpinned by spatial priorities at different scales using different criteria. For example, the map that you see here by Dinnerstein et al. In 2020, they developed a global safety net map which identified 50% of the terrestrial realm that, if conserved, would reverse further biodiversity loss. It would prevent CO2 emissions from land conversion and enhance natural carbon removal. This paper also highlights the vital role of indigenous lands in protecting biodiversity and reversing climate change. A counterpart study was also published in Nature, I think actually last week, by Sala et al. For the oceans. Another example that we may consider also in terms of restoration approaches, we can also think about Strasbourg et al., who found that restoring 15% of converted lands in protected areas could avoid almost 60% of extinctions and sequester 30% of global carbon emissions. So that's kind of a restoration approach. The map you see here on my slide is published by Locke et al., Harvey Locke et al., who explore the terrestrial world by combining global maps of a wide range of human uses and pressures. And he sorted them out into three broad conditions. So we think about cities and farms, shared landscapes, and large wild areas. And in this way, it's possible to identify a suite of conservation and sustainable use actions and practices that are appropriate to the values of each condition. And then metrics can be developed for these actions and practices at the national level. So again, just to reiterate, these are some of the approaches that could be used to scale up conservation based on prioritization, and then subsequently concrete actions can be taken. But we really need to know where it is important to scale up. Well, some of the unintended consequences, whilst the individual perspectives may be theoretically feasible from an area-based approach, they are potential ramifications, and these haven't fully been studied. So, for example, critics of Half-Earth have argued that the idea of Half-Earth is fraught with implications for human rights. It also is likely to have social implications, such as physical or economic displacement of people. There are also arguments about scaling up conservation in the sense that it fails to address the main drivers of biodiversity loss. So thinking of resource consumption and extraction. And we've already seen that, even with the current levels of protection, the protected area estate is not managed effectively as we're still losing biodiversity and is generally under-resourced. So in this particular case, any area-based conservation efforts would need to go hand in hand with other strategies. If you want to scale up, we also need to think about climate resilience strategies, sustainability strategies, even restoration efforts. The next perspective I just want to walk you through is around this concept of new conservation. And this perspective is arguably a pragmatic approach in terms of its alignment with the current socioeconomic system. So central to the new conservation position, and there's a lot of literature about new conservation, it's basically a shift towards viewing conservation as being about protecting nature in order to improve human well-being, especially that of the poor, rather than for biodiversity's own sake. So it's slightly nuanced here, and proponents argue that conservation needs to emphasize the benefits of nature to humans and explore the integration of conservation into, say, neoliberal economic approaches. The report that you see here at best highlights some of these approaches and considers the value of biodiversity and ecosystem services to people. Some of the approaches could also be thought of in light of the Dasgupta review that came out recently. And some approaches for this perspective could consider integration of biodiversity conservation into green or blue economy strategies. So green being land and blue being the ocean. And there's lots of literature and policy momentum being built around these strategies. Through concepts such as natural capital. So really understanding the value of what nature provides to people will help it will help people value and protect biodiversity in a different way. For example, we can also think of payments of ecosystem services under this approach, biodiversity offsetting, which can also contribute towards conservation and restoration of degraded land. If we also think about approaches like investing in natural solutions, so think about nature-based solutions to address climate change through climate adaptation programs, watershed management, and agricultural improvement. These sort of all fall under this new way of thinking about conservation. However, this approach may be considered too anthropocentric and fails to really consider the intrinsic value of nature. And this approach also may ignore the power of the right dimensions. So rights, so indigenous people and equity, and how such solutions or approaches lend itself to a kind of greenwash. And this has led in recent years to concern by some of the financial actors about greenwashing, where funds make unsubstantiated or misleading claims about environmental benefits of a product or a service or a technology or a company practice. And so again, caution is required in this regard. The fourth perspective that I just want to draw your attention to that we came across in this paper is somewhat a more radical perspective. And it considers reimagining civilization itself. So a systemic transformation towards a more just and sustainable and equitable world that does not just base itself on continuous economic growth. And this means eradicating hunger and poverty by providing sustainable and equitable access to all basic resources. And it proposes going beyond protected areas to embrace a way of life that balances human and non-human needs. Around this perspective, possible approaches that can be considered, well, recognizing governance, again, back to something similar we talked about as part of Aichi Target 11, recognizing governance of indigenous peoples and local communities over their territories of life. This perspective has asserted that coexistence between humans and nature is not only possible, but is best achieved under such governance or under equitable co-governance of areas. The paper that you see on this slide by my colleagues looked at the extent to which protected areas are governed by indigenous peoples and local communities and how these areas can prevent forest loss as well as protecting species. They also cover important areas for biodiversity and contribute towards ecological representation. As noted in the book that you see here by Busher and Fletcher, on radical ideas for saving nature beyond the Anthropocene. This book seeks to articulate how humanity needs to stop exploitative, extractive economic activities everywhere in order to sustainably manage and utilize natural resources. So things like transforming production and trade patterns and consumption patterns and shifting towards 100% clean renewable energy. These are some of the ideas and philosophies that are portrayed in this book. Again, some of the unintended consequences, despite raising important issues under the whole Earth perspective for conservation, and also rightly noting that setting aside half of our Earth for species will not preserve them if we continue on a path of unsustainable consumption and pollution, for example. But critics of the whole Earth approach reiterate that a shift away from protected areas may actually undermine the extensive long-term conservation efforts that have really resulted in positive gains for biodiversity and for people. These are gems, these are areas that need to continue investing in conservation efforts. As we know, protected areas are the biodiversity cornerstone, and they have huge amounts of benefits for species and also provide crucial ecosystem services. So again, these are some of the consequences that may emerge if further studies are not undertaken. So to summarize, although it's important to acknowledge different perspectives and philosophies driving action for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, it's also valuable to understand how aspects of the various elements of these perspectives can inform the development of an ambitious and actionable future global biodiversity framework. In a sense, these perspectives are not mutually exclusive, but can help one find a balance between ambition and practicality. So for example, we can learn lessons from the past Aichi Target 11 and improve our existing protected area network, but we also need to address the drivers of biodiversity loss, as noted by proponents of Whole Earth. So this is just really to reiterate that, again, it's not about picking and choosing what perspective we need, but it's a combination of these different elements that can help be channeled into an effective governance framework for biodiversity. Speaking of which, 10 years after the strategic plan that I mentioned earlier, and its 20 Aichi biodiversity targets were adopted, governments were due to discuss and adopt a new post-2020 biodiversity framework for the conservation and sustainable use at the 15th Conference of Parties in Kunming, China last year. But of course, as many of you know now, I'm sure that the meeting was postponed due to the devastating impacts of COVID-19. This framework essentially is going to be a critical opportunity for tackling the global nature crisis, and during which the world will need to change course if we are to realize the vision of living in harmony with nature, as well as achieving the SDGs. And this pandemic has really forced us to recognize that biodiversity loss cannot continue. And as governments gear up towards adoption of the new post-2020 framework this year, the negotiations must result in an ambitious and workable set of targets that protect and restore nature while equitably and sustainably sharing nature's contributions to people. And it's clear that some of the elements from the evidence presented here today and the studies that have been undertaken over the past 10 years, as well as world-leading studies like Bending the Curve that was also recently published in Nature, have helped inform the proposed targets specifically around area-based targets, which is currently reflected as target 2 in the post-2020 framework. For example, some of the evidence has penetrated through the framework in terms of ensuring that we have bolder conservation and restoration action, which can be achieved in part by recognizing efforts of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as well as private actors. Governance, participation, and equity essentially underpin the entire framework, which can be achieved. And multiple benefits to people also underpin this framework. And so we could end up with a framework for biodiversity that brings several elements from these perspectives together, and therefore, what may at first sight seem vastly diverging views are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But of course, I just want to reiterate again that protected areas and conserved areas don't end with achieving target 11 or target 2, but protected areas and conserved areas can contribute towards the achievement of other international agreements. For example, the CMS, Convention on Migratory Species, through well-connected corridors that support species movement, including those species that migrate due to climate change. The UNFCCC, protected areas act as carbon sinks that help mitigate carbon emissions. Multiple SDGs, such as Target 6 on clean water and sanitation, protected areas and conserved areas can contribute towards that, as well as not forgetting marine protected areas that are currently being discussed as part of a new international instrument under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, currently known as the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Agreement, that is also being negotiated this year, considers protected areas. But all of this can only happen if protected and conserved areas are well designed, they're effectively managed, well governed, and they're doing their job that they were set out to do in the first place. And I just want to end here to show a timeline which is regularly updated on the roadmap to Kunming. So if you want to know the latest updates of the meetings as they are being postponed, this timeline helps you to follow up with the latest news. And I just want to say, thank you to all the co-authors who helped with the paper and provided inputs and insights. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Just adjust my screen here. So thank you very much. I was intrigued by your comment about placement of protected areas and how governments essentially has been chasing the numbers to get to a percentage and not necessarily paying attention to the quality of the areas. And so leading on to that, I was wondering if one thinks about the added issues of climate change and the predicted effects and what we see, what's happening with regards to ecosystems and the predicted changes to species distribution ranges. To what extent does something like Aichi Plus, for example, focus on placement of new areas in proximity to other areas so that you can almost establish linkages and larger sort of continuous protected areas?
I think it's part of Aichi Plus. Well-connected areas are really important, but I think as far as Aichi Plus was concerned in terms of literature, it wasn't so clear how climate change scenarios are integrated into that. There may be more literature that comes out in relation to that, but if we think about using models and scenarios to predict where species move towards and using that information to identify, like you said, ecological corridors or transboundary protected areas, for example, that's where science really helps to inform the placement of these areas. And I think it's going to be more and more important to think about conservation at the land and seascape scale as we move forward, and think about how we can make protected areas more resilient to threats like climate change.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I'm going to open the floor. And so if anybody in the audience has a question that you'd like to ask Nina, you're welcome to unmute yourself and simply ask her the question straight out. Maybe while we wait for that, I've got another one for you, Nina. In the paper, you made reference to China and a sort of target that China sets itself in achieving. Can you maybe expand on that and your thoughts on that?
Yeah, definitely. I didn't want to go into, of course, too much detail in the presentation, but China has made remarkable progress in conservation. They have a concept called the Ecological Red Line initiative, and it's a national effort. It's a national way to ensure that their protected and conserved areas are managed effectively. So of course you have global targets and that sort of govern biodiversity conservation, but China in particular have taken it up at the national level and said, well, actually, you know, we are going to establish strictly controlled ecological spaces for biodiversity, but we're also going to say we're going to zone these areas out according to different uses. And I think it's just one good example of how global targets can help or assist countries to develop their own national biodiversity targets that are fit for purpose and suited to their own context, rather than, you know, requiring all countries to meet these obligations that they might not necessarily be equipped to do. So yeah, China was kind of a good example of the Ecological Red Line initiative that kind of struck out as a national way of thinking about conservation priorities.
And if I recall correctly, they're looking at conserving something like 25% of the land area by a certain year?
Yeah, I think it was almost 30%. 1/3 of their land they were going to try to conserve by 2030. But again, through different approaches. So it wouldn't only be about protected areas. It would definitely be considering different ways to do so.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 1/4 of its land.
Yeah. Does anybody else have any questions for Nina? I don't want to hog the conversation. Mohammed.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor. I have a question, and my question is on this. Considering the IC target of setting 17% of terrestrial ecosystem and 10% of marine ecosystem to protected areas, and this target is not yet met. But if you are to consider the situation now be.
Oh dear.
Sorry, Mohammed, you are breaking up.
Impacted to which development. The case that they're able to meet up with the climate challenge, with the climate change challenge. And now these protected areas are now being impacted upon to meet up with development, because developing countries are not trying to become developed, and so have to take a series of actions in order to meet up with that. So how may we tackle this? Thank you.
So I kind of unfortunately missed most of the question because the connection dropped. But if I try to understand your question, it was more around how can countries achieve the 17% and 10% target in light of other global challenges like climate change? Sorry, I missed the whole question.
Okay, my question goes thus, that considering the case, taking into account the case of European countries, where they are impacting on the already established protected areas to meet up with development, and how may we tackle this? Should developing countries remain underdeveloped, or what other mechanisms can be put in place in order to keep them in the process of development, and also so regarding the 17% terrestrial ecosystem and 10% marine ecosystem in protected areas?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. There's a big difference in the way developed countries have approached conservation and the way developing countries have approached conservation. And many of the large, I mean, you can see from evidence that in Europe, many of these protected areas are small and fragmented because of development. Whereas in Africa, for example, you know that many of these protected areas are large, expansive areas that allow for movement and migration of world-renowned species. And these massive, important conservation areas are important to safeguard species in Africa. And there's always going to be a challenge between meeting developmental needs and biodiversity conservation, I think. But there are certainly approaches beyond protected areas that are also recognized as important for biodiversity conservation. There's the whole new suite of idea of OECMs, the concept of OECMs. Those are areas where biodiversity is not the sole objective for protecting nature. And these are areas that may be considered as sacred sites, like I said earlier, or geological sites. So these are areas that are important for also conserving. And I think if we are to be on track to meet the 17 or 10%, there are other approaches that need to be recognized and managed appropriately beyond protected areas. And these include OECMs, they include ecological corridors that could also scale up area-based conservation, thinking about working with your neighbors in terms of transboundary protected areas. How can effective policy and governance be developed to co-manage protected areas across national boundaries? So there can be different ways to conserve and protect biodiversity to help countries achieve targets. But again, it comes down to making sure these areas are effectively managed, are well resourced. So indeed, I understand that the challenges around protected and conserved areas in the light of development. I hope that answered your questions broadly, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nina. While we wait for someone else to put their hand up, I wanted to ask you about those OECMs, the other effective area-based conservation
measures.
Who determines what an OECM is? Is that up to governments specifically, or?
So there will be, or there is actually already some guidance that has come out from IUCN. There's also on how to identify and recognize OECMs, and I think these would be done on a case-by-case basis, as protected areas are also designated at the national level and identified by governments as protected areas. The same would be true for OECMs, that countries or a recognized entity would recognize what an OECM is based on the criteria. If it fulfills that criteria, then it would be submitted as an OECM to the World Database on Protected Areas or the World Database on OECMs. And I think it really depends on a case-by-case basis, and it depends on the country itself. And there would be no imposition to say this is or this is not an OECM. It really, yeah, it will just depend on that kind of case-by-case basis and following the criteria that's available.
Okay, because I have to admit it was a bit of a loaded question because you may know that our situation in South Africa is that we have a whole game ranching industry where there's more land under protection by game ranchers than by official protected areas. And there's a bit of a debate every now and then going on in the country on, are these people actually making a contribution to conservation, or are they so much chasing the bottom line purely to make money that there really is very little conservation benefit. And so I was really wondering about the game ranchers in the country, whether they potentially would qualify as OECMs and make a contribution to conservation potentially. But there's that issue of effectiveness and management and how you actually monitor that, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. I think those issues are all covered in the guidelines as well as to whether game ranchers would qualify. I think the key thing there is also how it's managed. Is it an area for the long term? Is it in perpetuity? Is it going to be there for a long time, or is it just 20 years or so? And I think one of the key things with OECMs is that there are areas that are meant to stay, and they are managed in such a way that it's not just a one-off thing. So, moving around, I think that won't qualify. But again, I think the private entities who manage those game ranches, if they wanted their area to be considered as an OECM, to be recognized as an OECM, then they would have to work in partnerships with others to identify and make sure that we're not just capturing all kinds of things under the sun as OECMs, because that would be detrimental to conservation. So it needs to be really carefully managed and curated to ensure that we don't sort of greenwash the concept, because it has been a very rigorous process that countries have agreed to, and yeah, since 2010, and we only got the definition and then the criteria in 2018. So it's been a long road to get there, and I can imagine countries across the world would be cautious about integrating everything into a bucket called OECMs.
Okay, no, good points. I will give one more opportunity for anybody who's got a pressing question, because we're just about on the hour and we try and finish within an hour. So if anybody else has a question that they'd like to pose to Nina. Chloe.
Yeah, hi Nina. Thank you for the great talk. I really enjoyed that. I just wanted to ask, it's more of to find out your opinion. So I went to a talk on the diagnostic tool for transboundary conservation planners. So that was the vital sites. And I was wondering, it seemed like a really great initiative. It was getting different protected area managers to actually talk to each other and to think about the more global impact of their potentially smaller protected area. And I was wondering what you thought of these initiatives. Should that one be made larger, more accessible, because it seemed that you had to go to an interactive workshop, or should there be more examples of this this type of approach?
Thanks, Chloe. I absolutely wanted to attend that transboundary webinar, and I didn't get around to, and I didn't watch it either. And I should have actually. But I think approaches like that I think the more people who understand these approaches and who have access to these tools and are able to use them, I think there's a lot of value and a lot of benefits in, especially in transboundary protected areas. There are many protected areas that lie adjacent to country borders that are not necessarily protected as transboundary. So in terms of governance and how you manage protected areas across the countries in a controlled and a coherent way, I think we don't have very many of those. And if there are tools that become available to really help advance the implementation or the identification of transboundary protected areas across country borders and help to set up countries and help facilitate countries to better understand what international or what transboundary governance means, the implications, it takes many, many years. So I can imagine that, you know, again, it's a long-term process, and again, it also needs to be based on a case by case, because the country context will be so different, and how would you harmonize policies across countries as well. And so yeah, the diagnostic tool can help in many ways, but there's also the elements of capacity building, policy harmonization at the national and at the country level, essentially. It might be a very wishy-washy question answer, because I didn't attend that webinar, so apologies.
No, that was perfect. I just wanted to hear a little bit your opinion. So thank you.
Thanks, Nina. Anybody else? Okay, I don't see any other hands or any other questions in the chat, Nina. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. A really interesting presentation. And I'd encourage those who haven't read your paper yet to go and find it in conservation biology. It's available early online, and you can read it there, and I'm sure you can engage further with Nina. So thank you very much for your time. I'd also like to thank everybody who attended. And I'd like to just alert you to the fact that next Wednesday at 5 GMT, we will have another presentation. This will be by Kim Valenta from the University of Florida, and she will be presenting on the sensory ecology of fear. African elephants show aversion to olfactory predator signals. So you can find this or a link to register for this and to all of our other webinars on the SEB Emerging Issues in Conservation page. So thank you very much for your time, and yeah, I hope to see you in our next seminars.
Great, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Martin, as well, for hosting.
Pleasure, Nina. Thank you.
Great. Bye.
Bye.